Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Larsson. I'm an associate board governor of the FCC, and I'm delighted to welcome Greg Morley back to Hong Kong. He currently lives in Paris to talk to us about his new book and the book that's on its way. Such a fascinating career in HR and really people that brought you to DEI. And of course, welcome to all the FCC members and guests. So I'll start with a couple of housekeeping events. Is that we are really proud of our tradition of the club lunches because we talk about a wide range of subjects from arts to music to current topics to politics, economics. And we've got a really interesting screening Wednesday night about the adoption of Korean orphans right after the Korean War. And the member who is doing the screening is a FCC member. So I think we have really interesting interaction with our members through the club events. So to the topic today, it's a pleasure to introduce Greg, who's got such a wealth of experience with, well, actually you started with GE, right?
That's right.
Which is probably not the same sort of atmosphere as Disney and Hasbro and Moet.
Yeah,
Hennessy.
selling light bulbs to supermarkets was a different job than working in an entertainment field with Goofy and Mickey Mouse. Yes.
Yes, I can imagine. And I think I remember that Disney brought you to Hong Kong.
Correct. So I had started with Disney in 1995, which I'm sure for some of you was longer ago than it is for me. And we had the chance to come here. My husband and I met at Disney. He was not Goofy, I was not Minnie. It was a different, we were working in different parts of the company, but we had the opportunity to go to Paris first, and then Paris led to an opportunity to come here to work for 3 months at the opening of Hong Kong Disneyland. So 3 months became 17 years of our life.
Yeah, that's really, gosh, that's amazing. I think that's what happens to a lot of us in Hong Kong. We plan to come for a year or two, and that's what I planned to do in 2010. I'm still here 15 years later because it's a very easy city to fall in love with. So I think today, because we're such a nice and not too large a group, I've suggested to Greg that we do it as an open conversation, because I think everyone here has probably had a moment in the workplace when you felt excluded or you felt, inequality or not the right amount of, attention and focus spent on you as a human being. So I do please urge you to ask one question at a time and to try and stay with the flow of what Greg is saying. Because otherwise I'll stop you. and then I think it will be great. So can I ask you maybe to start with a few words about your background and about the book?
Sure. First of all, I want to thank you. We've had, this has been a journey, actually, to get up on this stage. And we had originally planned to do this last summer and wasn't able to do it, so we're happy to do it now and to be with all of these fine people. And also I want to thank my dear friend Mike Rogers, who was partly sponsoring this event, so thank you. And also I want to say that the book is for sale, and thanks to Bookazine for being here. Bookazine is the only place in the world where you can buy a physical book of Bond, and in light of what happened last week, any proceeds of the book sales will go to a charity to support what happened last week. So I encourage you to buy lots of books, not because I want you to click my bank account, but because we'll be able to do something useful for the community. And it's always a nice thing to do because it's Christmas time. You can buy a book and put in someone's stocking.
Thank you very much.
So a bit of my journey on the book, I came at book writing as a COVID baby. I was in my apartment up on Kane Road, encouraged by several people to start to write down some of my experiences and my stories. I have a lot of stories to tell. I'll tell some of them today. And I started to write the book, not knowing what was going to happen, whether I was going to do it, would I ever publish it. I had no idea what publishing a book meant or took to do. Ultimately, I did publish the book. And maybe as any of you have done any writing, I was writing the book in sequence. I don't do anything in sequence. None of us do that. You know, you're working on this while you're working on this while you're working on this. Everything happens kind of in parallel. And so when I finally published the book, I thought, oh gosh, I have to market the book. I have to promote the book. And so that's what I'm looking forward to with the next book I'm working on, which is, again, a lot of really compelling stories around the topic of resilience. And that book has been a lot of fun to put together because I know it's coming. And I hopefully one day will be able to share that with you here.
Great. So how did you, from being in sales at GE, how did you move into HR and DEI?
It's probably a good moment to tell a bit of backstory, and the backstory actually runs through Hong Kong. I'll show you some. This is me in the new and the current and the new book. So I, in my entire life, have been drawn to this notion of difference, and difference as being something that's very compelling and attractive. Which is not the case for, I think, a lot of people when you're brought up. Difference can be scary, it can be off-putting. But my parents were people who in their formative years actually spent time in Asia. I grew up in the east coast of the US in Philadelphia. So this is my father who spent several years in Tokyo as well as in Korea during the Korean War. And my father was a great raconteur. He had stories of everything that he had done. I think half of them were probably untrue. But he made this sort of life that he had seem very attractive and something that we wanted to, as my sister and I, experience. And it's really back to my mother, who I think some of you in this room have met and spent time with. And there's a passage in the book I'll read you. My mother was a great adventurer who came from the type of life you would not assume one would be an adventurer from. She was a primary school teacher. And I'll share this from the book because I think it says it better than I can for myself. So in her late 20s, unbounded by a recently broken premarital engagement, my mother learned about a teaching job with an American oil company in Saudi Arabia. It was 1958, wow. And she had signed a 2-year contract. Now, I can imagine none of her peers were going to Saudi Arabia. It wasn't something that people did. So she set out from New York, flew by propeller plane to Boston, then to Gander, then to Amsterdam, then to Rome, then to Cairo, then to Saudi Arabia. We take that kind of travel for granted now. She was going to earn twice as much as she could by teaching at home and live in company-supplied housing, which to her seemed very attractive. My mother was only the second Western woman to have entered the harem of the King of Saudi Arabia. Wow. Invited to share Western teaching methods within that environment. So she taught English for 2 years, during which time she met her fiancé, an American who was also teaching. They planned to marry when they both returned home. In preparation for their marriage, he returned to New York early. And on her way home, rather than go back the Rome to Amsterdam she decided to go the other way. And so she flew through the Middle East and traveled extensively for 6 months in India and Asia, reveling in the cultural immersion, amassing a treasure trove of interesting stories and experiences that, again, like my father, would be recounted for the rest of her very long life. These included meeting Somerset Maugham at the Oriental Hotel in Singapore, where she had drinks with him. Years before his disappearance, she also met Thai Silk King Jim Thompson. Oh, wow. In a similar setting. Now, you can imagine there weren't very many attractive Western women traveling solo in this part of the world, so it's safe to say she assumed a bit of attention. She then arrived in Hong Kong, where she decided to have a custom wedding dress made for the big day, and she awaited that and did her fittings. So she spent, I think, 3 days at what was the Hong Kong Hotel in Repulse Bay, which doesn't really exist anymore, and then at the Peninsula. I don't talk about this in the book, but you would appreciate it being in Hong Kong. She then, by complete chance, ended up as a walk-on extra in The World of Susie Wong in the movie. And you can see her in the entry sequence coming out of the Star Ferry behind William Holden.
Oh, yes, I remember that scene.
Sadly, while waiting for the dress to be completed, my mother received a late-night phone call in her hotel informing her that her husband-to-be had been shot and killed. He was an innocent bystander in a random shooting at the Carlisle Hotel in New York City.
Oh, my goodness.
Her travel adventures were cut short, and she returned home to pick up the pieces of her life. Shortly after, she met my father and met the man who became my father. So I explain this story because these are the kinds of stories that were told as we were growing up. And we always had this sense of adventure and going out and meeting different people and experiencing different things, and my parents generated that, and that eventually became us coming, my husband and I living abroad, me becoming very interested in diversity and inclusion. And beyond it as a technical topic, I understood the richness that it provided, especially in companies, and how it can really make a difference for people who work in companies to have this inclusive, open spirit of adventure.
Did you have any moments, when you were first working at GE or Disney, when you felt excluded, or that you felt a great sense of belonging, something you wanted to recapture and?
Great question. I think at GE I felt both. So when I joined GE, I was on a professional journey to establish myself to be legitimate as a professional. I was very early in my life. I was also coming out. And so I was constantly playing this balance of how much do I share. At the time, that was sort of forced on me because the partner I had at the time was very ill. So I had to share with my boss why I was pretty stressed out, why I had to step out of the workplace from time to time. He was in the hospital for a while, so I was sort of forced to expose myself in a time that I probably wouldn't have because I wasn't really ready for that. I was fortunate that my boss was, I would say, relatively undereducated on the topic, but he was willing to learn. I would say very much like my father was. And these two gentlemen became, I would say, fathers in different worlds of mine. Why the inverse of feeling included came is that once he could get his hand around it, once he kind of understood it, he made me feel like part of his family. And that changed the way I looked at work. Selling light bulbs in grocery stores is not glamorous work. And I can tell you more about it if anyone would want to hear about it, but I'm sure you wouldn't. But I stayed there for 8 years because of them. Because of him, because of his wife, because of my colleagues, because they made me feel like I worked in a safe environment and I could do the best work possible.
That's fantastic. And I think maybe not everyone remembers the CEO then, who was a pretty controversial guy, Jack Welch.
Jack Welch, right.
Right, who was, he was flamboyant, he was, he changed the company, but he was also probably toxic.
Yeah,
as a leader.
The culture in that environment was very different than the one that I ended up being in, say, a company like Disney. It was very macho culture. My colleagues were going to girly bars. So I had to do that too. That was not an environment I found very comfortable, as you can imagine. But you played the game at that time to go along. Now ultimately that stopped. But I saw that my boss was the protector of our team. There was a lot of very tough toxicity, and he sort of stopped it. And he created an environment which I think, that group of people who I worked with in my late 20s are still some of my best friends.
And is there a moment or an individual you can think of that was not included in any of these workplaces that by being more proactive about how you dealt with HR and issues of diversity, that you brought him in or brought her in?
Yeah, it's a great question. I haven't thought about it in a while. We had a woman who worked on the team, and she was definitely a second-class citizen in that environment. And those of us who were her peers really tried to take her under our wing and protect her a bit like a little sister, because that environment was very difficult for people that weren't killers.
Yeah.
And she was not a killer. She was good at her job. She sold light bulbs just as well as the rest of us, but that was not her instinct. And so we had to really gather around her. And again, she became very close to us because we became like a family, and that sense of inclusion was important. It went way beyond the workplace.
That's so interesting, because you could equally have ignored the situation, right? Just wanted to do better selling more light bulbs.
Yes. Yeah, I've told this story about, I think we talked about this, about a gentleman who worked for me in Singapore, who I had not met. He was the HR director for Singapore, for Southeast Asia when I joined Moet Hennessy. And the first time we met, we were having sushi lunch out in Harbor City, or out in, where did we used to work? Quarry Bay. I have this problem. Sometimes I don't even know where I am. So I arrived at the restaurant first, and he arrived in the restaurant later. And he was walking across the restaurant, and he had a really severe limp. And I thought, I had no idea that he had any kind of disability, because we had only met over Zoom, and we had been working together for years over Zoom. And you have this immediate reaction of, should I say something, or should I just ignore it? And I thought, well, he's never said anything, so I should maybe just ignore it. Like, maybe it's not a big deal to him. But the power of a diverse workplace is not ignoring it, it's taking advantage of the differences. So clearly, as a professional who's traveling around the region, he's learned things with the disability that I would never have insight to. So as I'm eating my lunch and thinking, oh, how am I going to talk about that? How am I going to address it? I don't want to insult the guy. And then I start being critical of myself. Maybe I'm the one with the problem, because I'm the person who's got the discrimination against a handicap. Anyway, I said something to him, and I said, I opened the door to the conversation. And he said back to me, he said, you're the first person that's ever asked me the question in that way, in such a supportive way. And so it changed the dynamic of our relationship. So from boss to subordinate, we became, I think, much more collegial. And I was able to help him be better in his job, not because of having a disability, but almost it was an additive part of our team and the functioning of our team.
I don't know if anyone would like to share a moment when they felt excluded or particularly included at work in connection with what we're talking about. Okay, then I'll ask my next question. When did, both year-wise and as part of the evolution of HR, when did DEI, which is diversion, equity, I always thought the E stood for equality, but equity and inclusion, when did that become part of the narrative?
Companies generally started to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the early 2000s. I think some of the leading companies. I went to my first diversity training in 1996. And actually, when I look back on that journey, one has to wonder why it is now almost 30 years later, and we seem to have stepped back. It's part of what I talked about in the book. Part of the reason I wrote the book was I saw that there was becoming more and more, I would say, dissonance around the topics, where discussions about diversity and inclusion were becoming more difficult to have. And I was thinking, okay, why is that? And to me, the diagnosis of why that was is we weren't talking to everybody. We were trying to attitude adjust people. And attitude adjustment does not work. So if we think, oh, you think about that the wrong way, or you said that word the wrong way, and then you're penalized for it, that is not a way to bring people along the journey. So Gay Games is a perfect example. Gay Games came to Hong Kong. A number of you were instrumental in that. Lisa was a co-chair of Gay Games, and Lisa was gracious enough to do an interview in the book. And if I can read that, part of that, she said I could do it, so. How diversity and inclusion becomes more inclusive. So one of the things I always say is diversity and inclusion became very clubby. And there's nothing against clubs, by the way. Thank you for inviting me here.
Thank you for the clarification.
But I mean in a way that it became very exclusive. Mm-hmm. There was a language people didn't understand. You know, we've had discussion about language. There were terminology that was off-putting to people. And for people who didn't feel excluded, when you start using language that's even more exclusionary, it doesn't make the topic something where people are going to jump to. Now, the reality is, I can show you in a second, the reality is diverse companies with inclusive cultures and inclusive leaders do better. So whatever your sort of political leaning or your emotional aspect about it is, it's just the fact. Data shows through Harvard studies, through Deloitte studies, through the Diversity Institute in Europe, that those companies do better. And why do they do better? Because every company wants the incremental effort. We all had, those of us that do work or did work, have a job description. If you work to the job description, you get paid for the job description, you get your bonus. The company wants just a little bit more. What is the just a little bit more? The just a little bit more is I communicate more fluently than my colleagues. Maybe I mentor younger people. Maybe I do something else that's a little bit off the job description. That's how winning companies win. And that's the beauty of diversity and inclusion, because that's how you get people into the conversation. So let me read my long teed up quote from Lisa. So Lisa was talking about Gay Games as a way of broadening the discussion in Hong Kong, which it very much did. And as we talked about it, it's not so obvious to think about gay sports.
Yeah.
Right? It's not the first thing that comes to most people's mind. So the part about this is called reach outside your comfort zone for allies. So one of the things that Lisa was talking about is in this work, the one thing that impressed me, the work of building allyship and spreading the word beyond the queer community. It's about increasing acceptance level and reaching outside. In the last year, we drew more and more people outside of the games, joining as volunteers. I got a mother who joined who has a 3-year-old boy who referred to the news of gay youth committing suicide after all the pressure by family and friends. She joined in thinking about her young son, that if he were gay, if all the mothers could be like her, we could just fold up Gay Games and go home. We're seeing people believing in the cause being not a gay sports event, the cause being an inclusive culture and an inclusive Hong Kong.
It's so interesting because I was in recruitment, executive search in financial institutions between early 1990s right through the global financial crisis, and working, because I used to work for Morgan Stanley and Lehman, so working for companies like that, there was no discussion about inclusion or diversity. It was about, oh, we'll use Barbara because she was one of us. She knows exactly what we're looking for, right? And that's how we came at it for all those years. And it's overlapping with when you said diversion and inclusion started in 1996, right? It's really kind of interesting.
Yeah, and it's evolved. So if you were recruiting now for a certain generation, they would likely either lead or soon after ask you what you were doing with diversity and inclusion, because they're preempting what's it going to be like to work in this company.
Yes.
And I have a lot of options in Hong Kong. I can work in another bank. I could work in bank 3, 4, 5. So which one's going to provide me an environment where I feel like I'm accepted, where I belong, and ultimately where I can do my best work? And so that's how this, if I can tag to the data without going into a lot of, sorry, I'll go through this. So this is what happens when you have a diverse team. And this, again, is data. So I believe it, but it's data. So the data shows that diverse teams perform better because there's more creativity. And you can imagine around a table of people, if I look at the table of people, I know many of you, and I think if I put a topic on the discussion of the table, what you would come out with would be incredible. Because you all come from different backgrounds, you have different experiences, you're born in different places maybe, That's why diverse teams are more creative. Now, for the bankers in the house, why is it important to have diverse teams around the table at a bank? Because people with different perspectives see risk differently.
Yeah.
Right? Because you grew up differently. You grew up in a different environment. Your parents were different. Your colleagues are different. So risk reduction is important. So then you marry that with an inclusive environment. Why is inclusive environment important? Because people can speak up. So it's great to have diversity around the table, but if I don't feel like I can give my opinion, then why have it? So diverse teams that are inclusive perform better. They're more likely to hit financial targets, they're higher performing, and they're more innovative and agile. And then the last part, which is the cherry on the top of the cake of diversity and inclusion, is that when you have a leader who understands how to make it work, then the results speak for themselves. And how does it make it work? I always think it's like the inclusive leader is like a conductor in an orchestra. The inclusive leader knows how to ask for the violin and turn down the drums. He or she needs to know how when the cello comes in and the tambourine goes down. So that's how taking advantage of diversity looks sort of in an orchestra setting, but also looks in a team setting.
A battle I had as a headhunter was very much trying to get top banks to consider somebody who didn't have a college diploma. Okay, and generally didn't come across many people who applied for the jobs without the college diploma. But there was one guy who was absolutely brilliant, so smart, such a thinker outside the box, and he would have been perfect for the job that I was recruiting for. Could not get anyone to interview him. I mean, I must have tried 15 banks. People just would not consider it.
And I would guess the bank that finally took him, or whatever organization finally took him, was the winner, because they got a great talent that was, sort of under-recognized. And even for that person to be accepted somewhere was probably, like me in the light bulbs, would work harder, would stay later, would do more.
Well, he ended up staying for the bank where he was, and they began to recognize how valuable he was, and he grew within the organization. So they obviously looked at including him.
So I've worked in an industrial company, a hospitality entertainment company in Disney, a toy company at Hasbro, a luxury company in LVMH, and the same is always the true. I mean, in LVMH it was always, does this person have a luxury background? Does it matter? I mean, I didn't. Now, whether I was successful or not, you can ask my boss, but it was more about how I came to problems, how I tackled problems, and I think you see in bigger companies that is becoming more and more appreciated. And I think a couple of you are very successful recruiters, and so you know that, again, person's track record, because they worked for Estee Lauder, and then they worked for Vuitton, and then they worked for Dior, or whatever, the Richemont, isn't necessarily a path to success when they go to Gucci or when they go to the next luxury company. Now, what somebody did rather than where they worked, that is the more compelling roadmap to success.
It's probably also a form of laziness from the employer or from the boss, because you have to work a little bit harder if the person has a different background. It's very easy to say check, 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 and this person will fit in. Was that what?
Hallelujah, yes. From the HR perspective, yes, I think it's also a bit of laziness. It's the safe play.
It's a safe play.
And again, back to winning companies don't always make the safe play. That's how they get have an incremental profitability. That's how they get the incremental role. That's how they get the incremental customer. And the other thing, which we haven't talked about, is, as we were talking at lunch, if you're in an organization that has consumers, and your organization doesn't reflect the consumers, how are you going to think about what they need, right? If you have nothing against my former company, but it's a French company. It has a lot of history. A lot of the success of the company is based on the history of the company and French culture, because we're selling French culture. But that has to translate into somebody wanting to buy it. And so if we don't understand it, we didn't understand as a company and make the bridge, between French company and Hong Kong culture or French company and Taiwan culture, then you run into a dead end. And so that's why, again, the diversity is important in terms of having your employees reflect your consumers as well. But it's not easy, because you'd say the safe play is just hire the French person, because they've done it before. They're tied to us. They have their French pension. They can't go anywhere anyway. So we'll move them around, right?
Okay, if I may, I will ask one last question, and then we'll open it to the floor. How do you spot a toxic person? What do you do with toxic people? Is it better do you give them several chances? How do you deal with toxicity in the workplace?
I think maybe I'll just give my personal example, because I think I handled toxicity in the early parts of my career very poorly. Is advice I gave a Hong Kong friend who just moved to London, and he has just got promoted in his first management job. And the advice I gave him, because he asked a very similar question, he's inheriting a team, and I said, you have a very short window to make changes to a team that are, you can say, it's not me, it's the person before me that hired these people. And dealing with people who are not performing is normally a good indication of toxicity. And what does performing mean? They may be racking up the sales. I could have been selling light bulbs like crazy, but they may be driving everybody else crazy. They may be dismissive of their customers. They may be potentially putting your company at risk because they don't follow the rules of compliance or anything else. So the number one thing that you can do as a leader for your own brand, me, is to deal with it head on. The risk of toxic people, and you ask about spotting them, I think we all have enough instinct to say, that's not working, right? We all have had enough experience. Trust your instinct when it comes to people. Most humans have good instincts about other people. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in management. The company saw something in you that you can do to do that job, is to deal with people head on, is to say...
Yeah, but sometimes, you say, oh, he's got a difficult home situation, or he's been ill for... you make excuses for people, and then it drags on, and then you wonder whether you were right in spotting that toxicity.
So I always fell flat because I thought I had this savior complex. I would come into a team and I'm like, oh, this person hasn't worked for the right person.
Right, okay.
It was always about that's why I always didn't know I was gay, because I hadn't met the right girl. So I was not gonna save, you can't save everybody, right? They have to work in the culture that you've created or that your company has. And so, yes, there can be excuses, but you can unpeel them quite quickly, I think. And then, give people a chance, right? We talked about a situation that you had in giving somebody the chance, giving them some accommodation, but being very clear that it's not an unlimited arrangement. Mm-hmm. They have to improve or move.
Yeah.
And that ultimately is better for you as leader, because it makes the other people around the table say, she's fair, she's maybe tough, but she's fair, and I'm willing to stick it out in this company.
Great, thank you. Can we open it to questions? We've got about 15 minutes.
Roger.
Greg, can you tell us your story of coming out at work? Did you come out gradually, suddenly? Did you tell your boss? Was it by accident? Or can you just share with us what happened and what reaction you got from your boss and your colleagues?
The reality is, if I use my own situation, coming out never ends, right? So every time you meet somebody, you're coming out. You have to, again, engage in the conversation, because the assumption is, as late as when I joined Moet Hennessy in 2018, I was going around the office, and everybody asked if my family had moved with me to Hong Kong. I said, yes, my family has moved. And I would say, my husband and my dog. And people would say, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh.
So you're constantly in this situation of like coming out again. Do I want to do that? I mean, it's one of the reasons I didn't want to go work for another company, because I didn't want to come out again. So when you think about younger people that are coming into your business, that's something that's very important about creating a sense of inclusion, that people don't feel like they have to hide who they are to be their best at work. Because ultimately, if I'm dancing around like, you might say, what'd you do this weekend? Oh, I played paddle. Who'd you go play paddle with? My friends. You have this kind of restricted way, you don't want to get exposed. So my coming out was not necessarily something I planned, but as I said, I had a partner who needed me, and I needed to be there for him. And so I had to explain to my boss, who was not ready for it. I came out to my parents, they were not ready for it. But they came on the journey with me, and I was very fortunate that, when I look back on coming out personally, my father died 2 years after I came out to my parents. And the last 2 years of his life, we were like best friends. Because as he said to me, he's like, I never understood that. He said, I really don't understand it anyway, but it's the first time we've had something to talk about. And so he had this respect for me, which then allowed him to share all kinds of things, some things I didn't want to hear, but he shared a lot. And so we became like very close, and it would have never happened had we not had that sort of moment of inclusivity at home. Even at Disney, when I joined, it was not, everybody wasn't coming out all the time. It can still be an environment where people don't feel comfortable. Hasbro, again, it was the same thing. Like, did you move here? Who you're living with? The dog and the husband. Oh, I'm sorry. And again, even LVMH, I think, is the same. It's the same journey over. It's for those of you that have friends in the gay and lesbian community, understand that their life is often a continual coming out. And then you extrapolate that to others, people who might have a chronic disease at work, people that might have a disability at work, people who want to be, very authentic about the challenges they face as a woman at work. That's all coming out, and it happens all the time. So I think if we're more sensitive to that, you grab onto those people, and like I did with my father, you just create a totally different dynamic. Thank you for the question.
Interesting. Mandy.
Not so much a question, more so, I probably don't need the microphone because I speak quite loud. More so a comment, I think. I've been here for 25 years, so I'm in HR. I've gone through the whole diversity, DEI, wave, and how we're meant to do that in the organisations. I'm now looking for an opportunity in Hong Kong, and I'm coming up against, we need to have more local. We need to have language ability. We need to. So it seems to me that whole diversity wave that we were riding very high over the last 5 years or before COVID even, has now kind of stopped a little bit.
It's gone the other way, you're saying. Yes.
The other way. I don't find that a lot of companies are open to the diversity that they probably need to have.
We're promoting, yeah.
Yeah.
And also, maybe as Westerners, then we're feeling what local people might have felt for a long time.
I don't want to say that.
Yeah.
In so many words, but I do feel like I'm the person now that's not inclusive in this environment.
Yeah.
Because, I'm not getting those opportunities anymore. Yeah, it's just more of a comment. It's quite interesting, and I feel like it's flatlined a little bit in some ways.
I was reflecting last night on the companies that have sort of stayed the course and the companies that have gone off the course. And there's maybe two extreme examples, and I don't think anybody works for either of them, so I can talk about them. The first example is a company like Harley Davidson. So they were off immediately. Now my guess is that Harley Davidson was kind of playing the PR game. I've never worked there, I don't know anyone that works there, but I imagine what a Harley Davidson consumer looks like. So, yeah, okay. But were they really committed? I don't know. It's very easy to back away if you're not that committed. Maybe they were planning year to year. They may not have changed a lot of their policies to be inclusive. They may not have changed their recruitment system to be inclusive. Then on the other side of the spectrum, you have a company like Marriott. So Marriott's CEO very recently, very publicly said that when challenged at an investor conference about diversity and inclusion, he said, "This is who we are. I can't change that Marriott accepts guests from 180 countries around the world, and so, maybe you should submit an application to Marriott." But I think it's important to don't try to run up against the wall of companies that don't have the value system that will encourage you to thrive.
I just feel like it's gone with what they have as employees now. Yes, they're actually looking at that and they're very inclusive and diverse, etc. But from a recruitment perspective of bringing new people into organisations, I've found over the last couple of years it's a lot less of them looking at more of a diverse.
There's certainly a chilling effect, and there's a certain sense of how people look at different words. They look at different applications, and you would have hoped that the work and the investment had been done to make recruitment systems less biased would pay off. I think in some places it has. I see that in the company I was working for. It became you were getting much more diverse profiles. So I'd encourage you to just keep looking around at the right companies with the right value systems, because ultimately it comes back then to the value system.
But I think it's interesting because we talk about DEI as sexual, gender, right? But actually it's also about age. So when I opened in Singapore, I ended up hiring people over 60 because you got some help from the government. And for some of the work that I needed to be done, they were perfect, detailed, great attention to doing the reports properly, all of that kind of thing. But it's also an age.
Ageism is probably one of the most
and disability, right?
Reported discriminations, because it's very easy to discriminate against older workers, either because of statute or just the general belief that older workers are not as productive.
What's that movie, The Intern, with Robert De Niro? I mean, that's just so great.
The point about taking advantage of diversity rather than sort of managing around it, I had a very good example of this. When I worked for Disney, we had to hire thousands of people every year. And some of the hardest positions are the hard jobs. I mean, you walk around Disney, everything looks, everybody's in their costume, they look great. But there are people in the back cleaning, scrubbing, and one of the hardest jobs to fill were people that pot wash. They take the stuff from the kitchen and they wash pots, because nobody wants to work in that environment. And in Florida, we ended up doing an arrangement with a school of the deaf, because no one would hire deaf people because they would say, it's dangerous for them because they won't hear things, there's a safety issue.
Oh, interesting.
But it was an advantage for them to work in that environment because the sound was not damaging them. And so that's
really
using say a disability, but a unique ability to its benefit.
That's really interesting because sound pollution is something that people wanted to prevent themselves from having to
so
deal
who would
with.
want to work in that environment except for people that can't work because people won't hire them, and then they work in that environment and they thrive.
How interesting. I don't know all your names, so please say your name.
Hi, my name's Renata. I think I can say my name. I was wondering, if you were made Chief of Staff at the White House, what would you do?
Great question.
That's a Chief of Staff at the White House. I mean, if I would have to totally put my value system aside, because I would have never engaged in that kind of environment, I think it's also probably quite toxic. If someone invited me in to say, how do you help them, I'm not sure that it's a situation that could be turned around. But to the point that, to the point of this book is that most humans have very strong feelings about something. I'll tell you a quick story about a taxi driver that I met. It's a less politically toxic question than what you asked, but it gets to the point. So I was in London about a month ago, and I got into a taxi, and I was going to a town called Islington, which is part of London. I got into the taxi. I said, I'm going. He said, where are you going, mate? I said, I'm going to Islington. And he says, God, the lefties have ruined that part of town. Oh, my God. I looked at my phone. I was thinking, how long am I going to be in this taxi? And then he starts right into the whole pronouns. And I think, like, hi, my name's Greg. Talk to me about pronouns. So I thought, OK, I can learn something from this guy. Because I have 30 minutes. I might as well use the time wisely, and I better practice what I preach. And so we had this discussion about pronouns, and I said, where are you hearing all this stuff about pronouns? And he said, well, I'm in the taxi all day. I listen to talk radio. Okay. And so I said, my name's Greg. What's your name? This is, of course, him looking back, in the thing, and we're talking through the screen, and he said, my name's Alfred. And I said, do you mind if I call you Al? And he said, I don't like the name Al. My name's Alfred. I mean, he got very cold. And I said, you can see that it's important if people want to be called something that you call them that. It's respectful. Yes. And so we had this kind of back, and he said, that's a good point. Now, this discussion went on for 20 minutes. He told me about how he likes to fix up old cars and what his wife likes to do. I was talking about living in Paris with my husband. We get to Islington. We're buddies by now. Is he going to vote Labor in the next election? I don't think so. But we came to some kind of understanding. And he said, do you mind if I show you something? I'm going to turn off the meter because it's just around the block of where you're going. And I said, sure. He pulls up in front of the side of the road, and he pointed to a door, a black door, number 50. And he said, you see number 50? And I said, yes, I see it. He said, that's the house I was born in. And so I said, and he said, you would have never come here when I was born to have dinner. And so I said, so the lefties maybe didn't ruin Islington. And so we had a chuckle about it. What's the point of the story? The point is that he and I come from different places. We have different perspectives. But if I were to go into the White House, the first thing I would try to do is understand where people are coming from, right? Because if I try to go in and impose my lefty, gay, pronoun ideology on everyone, no one's going to listen to me. If I try to understand, to the perspective that Lisa brought to my book, which is bring people into the conversation, don't threaten them, don't accuse them, and try to understand, because people feel strongly about things for a reason. Are we going to get people in the White House to come over to a different ideology? Maybe not, but maybe they appreciate something they didn't hear before.
Thank you.
I'm not interested in the job. Thank you for thinking of me.
We've got time probably for another 2 questions.
I'm wondering, what's your experience in terms of driving the right behaviors in this moment of change? I'm like you. I've been working in different companies, and I was lucky enough to work for companies who place diversity really at the center for many of the reasons you mentioned. But you're right. The world is changing, and there's a big temptation to do differently now. But in my experience, it's about the company, but it's also about the individuals who are driving that culture. So in your views, how, as a HR leader, as a manager, you can make sure that those as being recognized are being rewarded for displaying such behaviors?
In my experience of 4 big companies, the successful companies in this space and the successes I've had in this space is sustainable, systemic change. So everybody loves to have an International Women's Day event. But so what? What did you do about it? Did you change a policy so that women who are going through menopause can have some time off? Did you change a policy so that women who are trying to have children can have some support? Or we just have pink champagne? So I think that's part of it. We were talking about recruitment systems. Did you look at the recruitment system and see how many women end up on the other end versus men? And did you try to make that more equitable? That's one thing. The second thing is there has to also be a leadership philosophy that's consistent. If boss X comes in and says this is important, and then boss Y comes in and says it's not important, we're not going to fund it, that's not sustainable. And what I had talked about before is trying to not attack people for what they believe, but trying to understand what they believe, and not trying to change an attitude, but change the system, change the process, change the things that reinforce. And ultimately, if a company's clear and consistent about its values, then that's why people are either attracted or repulsed by it, right? If I come to Estee Lauder and you were interviewing me, I'm sure I would ask the question, like, what values are important to this company? What values are important to you as a leader? And then you would say, it's this, this, this. I would believe you or not, and then maybe we would work together. So I think those things. Back to my 1996 experience of going through diversity training at Disney and why 30 years ago we're still talking about it. It felt really good to go through diversity training being somebody who came from an underrepresented community, at least in part of my life. But there was nothing sort of that hung on to it. We had a gay employee group. That felt really good. It was like going to the bar. I was hanging out with my buddies, but nothing really came of it. So sustainability is important as much as celebrating and ultimately holding people accountable.
Very interesting. One last question.
Hi, Greg. I want to ask you about your second book. I think we're going through a period right now where there is a chill in the DEI space, and we're living through a very divisive world, a lot of different viewpoints and people not really listening to each other. So I want to kind of ask you about, you mentioned it was about resilience, and I think especially among the younger generation, the Gen Zs and the Alphas, this is a very despairing time for a lot of them. And so what are your views on resilience specifically for those generations, but also in general? And what is your second book about?
Thank you. Okay. The hopeful news is that I should have a manuscript today, New York time. Then the hard work begins because we have to start editing. I was very inspired by a number of people who have gone through journeys that mere humans, mere mortals would find overwhelming, but I think are lessons and lessons we can learn from. The first was, again, back to my mother. When I was sitting with her in her last weeks, I kept thinking, gosh, there's some lesson here in her life, and how do I capture that lesson? I was sharing that story with my friend Jack, who's sitting back here, and he also has had this remarkable story of resilience. And so I started to kind of piece together some of these learnings, and they have to do with community and tenacity, and I think resilience is something that can be learned. And so I've tried to, in that book, bring it down to a level that we're all resilient. We all find resilience in our own way. And it's not something that's impossible for people to grab onto. And especially, I think it's especially relevant now. And I didn't want the book to be, just like in this book, I told a lot of stories. The book's called Rally, A Guide to Resilience, and it's also a lot of personal stories. And I think that I can see myself in that person's story, and I can take some lessons from that individual's very inspiring journey, whether it was a health journey, a career journey, losing a home journey, losing a company journey, losing a family member journey, whatever those things are. So I'm as excited about getting the book done as I am about sharing these incredible stories of people who blessed me with sharing their stories with me. And I would sit with people who were telling me these stories, and it was incredibly humbling. And so I feel now like I'm the godfather of their stories, the keeper of these stories, and I can't wait to share them with people. Thank you for asking.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you all for coming to the FCC. If you're not a member, think about being a member. You don't have to be a journalist. And I hope to see you again next year for the book and a present from the FCC.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a rare experience having been so many times in your seat and then to be up here. I could have never imagined it, so it's a bit of a dream come true. And again, remember that any sales of the books are going to be donated, so please feel free to liberally apply your credit card at the door. Thank you.
Thank you.